Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good whatever time it is, wherever you are, whoever you are. Welcome once again to No Nerd Caliber, the show in which we talk about some of our favorite things within a given nerdy topic, usually connected to what will be the topic of our Thursday show, Full Fat Spoiler Chat. And that is the case tonight. Thursday, we'll be talking about the recent science fiction rom-com called Moonshot. And so tonight, our topic is our top, well, it's usually three, but since I'm solo tonight, it'll be our top four science fiction romantic comedy stories, movies, whatever happens to be the medium that it's told in. I'm Rodney Brown. I'm the editor-in-chief of Nerd Caliber, first-person shooter on Facebook and Instagram as a cosplay photographer, Burley_adopter on Twitter, a couple of other places doing a bunch of other things. And like I said, tonight our topic is going to be top favorite romantic comedies in science fiction in any particular medium. And we might as well just jump right into it. But before we do, let me just say that anybody who's in the chats on Facebook Live or Twitch or YouTube, feel free to jump in with your own comments about either the topics, the subjects I'm talking about, or anything that you particularly think is in your list of top romantic comedies within the science fiction genre. And just to be clear, I'm talking about stories in which the romance is, not romantic comedies, romances. In which the romance is a central part of the story and it is in a science fiction setting. So what's an example I can use for something that I wouldn't consider to be particularly a romance story with a science fiction tale? And I had a really good example of this earlier. Well, I'll tell you. When I get to my honorable mention, I think that the romance is core to this, but it's also so much more than a romance story that this would be an example of something that barely fits in my estimation. I put a bunch of not so serious things and some serious things in the teaser stuff. And one of them that is a good example that I just saw was Invincible. Invincible has a romance, a couple of romances actually, at its core, or that are integral to the story, but they are not the core story of Invincible. The family dynamic is the core story of Invincible. So that would be one that didn't, in my mind, actually qualify. So, before we get into all of those, we're going to do our first little promo here like we usually do at the beginning of the show, and that is to ask you to check us out on Twitch. At the URL down there, twitch.tv/nerdcaliber. We stream on Twitch for all of our live shows just like we do with Facebook Live and with YouTube. So we're trying to grow those numbers on Twitch to be sort of like the other two. So please, if you have a Twitch account, check it out, and please follow us. All right, back to getting into the topic to begin with. Number 4 on my list is a book from back in 1971, Poul Anderson's Dancer from Atlantis. I believe I got this and read it when I, maybe in like 73 or so, when I was maybe 13 or 14. I'm sure you can tell that I probably bought it because of the cover. But also because I, at that point even, was a big fan of sort of ancient history. And this is a time travel story about people who wind up getting caught by mistake in the time machine from, the far future of even this book's current, which is 1970, and get hauled back into the ancient past to probably around 1560 or so BC, basically just before the island of Thera or Santorini explodes, leading to the downfall of the Minoan civilization and possibly the creation of the Atlantis myth. So the the story centers on the main character is from our timeline. He's a 40-year-old Seattle architect, Duncan Reed, who is on a cruise with his to Japan with his not estranged at this point, but increasingly distant wife, and suddenly just disappears. Along the way to the 16th century BC, they pick up an 11th century Russian knight named Oleg, a 4th century Hun, Uldin, and a 15th century or 16th century, not really priestess, I guess, a woman, a mature woman, from one of the islands that still has a sort of mixed Minoan Mycenaean culture, Arissa, who, in the time that they land, which is about 2 or 3 decades prior to her current age when she was picked up, remembers that she had a relationship with the main character, Duncan Reed, when she was younger and was a sort of not quite a priestess, but a consecrated bull dancer. If you don't know what the Minoan bull dances are, go look that stuff up. It's just amazing, fascinating aspect of the Minoan religious culture. And so I remember this book. I love the idea of these people from different times. The characterizations of all of these characters are really good, including the people that they encounter in the ancient period that they're in. The plot about how basically the power of the enormous explosion that completely destroyed, well, not completely, it took what was basically a round, fairly large island and turned it to a ring of islands with an enormous lagoon in the middle. The power of that explosion might be enough to power the time-traveling ship device that got them caught up in its wake, to use a completely inaccurate term, and hauled them into the past, getting them back to their own timelines. And how they try to do that, the curveballs that wind up in their way, trying to negotiate the politics. So this takes place at a time when the Athenian tribute, Theseus is a prince in Athens at this point, but the Athenian tribute of young men and women has been going on for decades and decades to the palace Knossos, where King Minos lives, and supposedly the labyrinth of the Minotaur. And so there is a great deal of political and outright conflict, struggle, not quite leading to warfare, but it's definitely a people who believe they are subjugated, and to some extent they are, the Achaeans, the Mycenaean Greeks and the Athenians, against the Minoans. So that's the backdrop of all of this. These people from different timelines or times in the future have to figure out how to work around. And so that was my memory of it. And then I remembered there was this, strongly felt, deeply held romance between Duncan Reed and Arissa. What I forgot in the intervening almost 50 years is that the relationship between Reed and Arissa isn't between 40-year-old Reed and probably 30 whatever year old Arissa. It's between 40-year-old Reed and the Arissa of that time that they landed in, who's a teenager. And again, considered holy by the people around her because she's a consecrated bull dancer. And once I going back and researching this for this particular piece, I realized that it's like, wow, I didn't realize that was quite so problematic. And for a second there, I remember thinking, well, I remember, now that I think about it, that he was really reluctant, that he kept, there was a whole lot that was wrong with this relationship. But then I remembered that, the older Arissa, who gets picked up along the time, or by the time machine, had a kid by him. So, yeah. She has an adult son by Duncan Reed. So, obviously, he didn't keep his hands off her. So, for that reason, it's definitely number 4. If I'd had enough time to think of a number 5 before I started doing this research, I would have dropped it, and that would have been my number 4. I still love the setting. I love Poul Anderson's dynamic writing. It's, you know, aside from that incredibly problematic thing, it's a good story. It's a good exciting, action-filled, exciting science fiction time travel story with, at that time was a very innovative interpretation of what might have been the Atlantis myth. And based on research that literally had just started 4 or 5 years prior to the book being written. It's a big a whiff if you really don't want to read that sort of stuff, and I absolutely understand why you might not want to. But because of nostalgia glasses, it's going to stay on my number 4. All right, my number 3 is another science fiction book, and that is Metropolitan by Walter John Williams. This probably could be classified more as science fantasy, although its trappings are that everything in here is based on the scientific principles around what their world is like. So it's kind of science fiction. It's really hard to say. So the book is set in a world that is completely built up by city, like Trantor in the Foundation series or Coruscant in Star Wars. But this planet is completely covered by something called the shield. It's a barrier that allows, or either allows the pass-through of, or emits its own light and heat to keep the planet below it, obviously under conditions where people can live. But if anything tries to go through it, it incinerates all matter that comes up to the point where it would interact with the shield. Absorbs all electromagnetic energy that might be directed at it. So the world has no day or night or seasons. And this world runs on something called plasm. Plasm is essentially an energy source that flows like plasma, that is created when the geometry of things being constructed reach a certain point. And every time something else is added to it, more plasma is generated in the world, or more plasm. The story centers around Aya, a young woman who is a low-level functionary in what is essentially the equivalent power utility. It is the authority that manages the plasm conduits and sources within her metropolis. And all of this gigantic city world is divided up into individual metropolises as opposed to nations or states. And most of them are run by a single authoritarian figure called the Metropolitan. Hence the name of the book. She discovers this just ridiculously deep and untapped source of plasm that nobody knows about, manages for whatever reason to keep it secret, or decides to keep it secret, and the reason has to do with the cultural background that she comes from, which is clearly sort of inspired by the concept of the Romani, or the Roma people. But she decides to take this information to Constantine, who is a very powerful sage, I guess is the word that they use here. He is that's sort of a combination of mage and scientist in this world. He can do things with plasm that would be called magic if this was set in, say, a magic fantasy world. But he is also a very visionary political theorist, and somebody who, if once he and Aya develop a relationship, and once it becomes deep enough, she discovers that he also believes that the shield is something that's keeping them from greater knowledge, and he wants to get rid of it. So the book basically gets them up to a certain point of him reaching the ability to have the power to try to do this, with the help of Aya and other people that are connected to her. There's a sequel called City on Fire that gets them closer to this point of trying to figure out what the shield is, and then for various reasons that have to do literally with publishers and rights and so on, Williams just got sick of writing the book. It was in one publisher. They wouldn't give the rights up when he moved to a different publisher, and it was just a big, big mess. And he has not touched it since the second book came out in the very late 90s. He has said recently, just I think in March, that he is considering writing the third book, the sequel to it, and finishing out the trilogy, which I really hope he does, because I really like the series. But core to it is the romance, the growing romance between Aya and Constantine, which kind of weaves in and out of romance throughout the course of the two books, which is very interesting. Particularly in the second book, Aya very much comes into her own as a person who is comfortable, dealing with and wielding and manipulating political and, in one aspect here, religious power. So it's a very cool, very interesting setting, very well-written book about a very complex relationship between two people who are romantic but also understand that there are really much deeper political, social things that affect their lives at every second that could be way more important than whatever romance they have. So it's a really cool book. I would recommend it highly. I don't know if you could ever adapt it. I don't know that there's enough action to adapt, that it would be done well enough, or that people would take to it. But if it does, I think it could be a really, really interesting movie, or short, series on, well, not Netflix, because they're not spending money on anything anymore, but Amazon or whatever. So yeah, Metropolitan, Walter John Williams, check it out. Very interesting book. All right, so that's my number 3. My number 2 is very recent, and that is Matrix Resurrections. And specifically, I chose Resurrections because while all 3 stories are built around the romance between Neo and Trinity, this one, the romance is a driving part of the plot and the story, not just sort of the background and character motivation. Now, there are great character motivations in the original trilogy, particularly in the first movie, and to some extent even more so in the second. But Matrix Resurrections, their relationship becomes part of the plot, a very, very important part of the plot. And so I think that makes it even more of a romance as a science fiction story than any of the previous ones. I don't need to go into any detail about what this story's about. If you haven't watched The Matrix, I'm not really sure why you're watching this channel, because it seems like that would be so right up your alley. But you may not have seen The Matrix Resurrections. The gist of it is that Thomas Anderson is, living in a world in which he realizes that this whole Matrix thing was a delusion, that he used to drive the creative process to develop a video game series, a trilogy called The Matrix, about people who are plugged into. It's basically the story of the first three. The video game is the story of the first three movies. And as you might imagine, that may or may not actually be real, and then it's about what is real. When he first sees Trinity in a cafe, of all things, who doesn't go by the name Trinity, doesn't understand or remember any of the stuff that had happened before, but he instantly realizes that there's a connection between the two of them, and there's something going on there. And the story then basically tells how he discovers what the truth is, the various things that are in the way of him acting upon that truth, but at every stage of that, it is the romance between Neo and Trinity that is driving the plot, driving all of the things that have been possibly set up for him, or anyway. I don't want to give a whole lot away. It's a recent movie, came out in December, so there may be a lot of you that haven't seen it yet that want to. So I would recommend that you do. But yeah, that's my choice for my number 2. So I'd mentioned earlier my honorable mention, and my honorable mention is the Expanse TV series. I haven't read the books. I'm assuming the books, because everything I've read is that it hews very, very closely to the books, are similar in the nature of how it deals with the relationship between Naomi and Holden, with the two characters shown on the screen here. And in the series, this is absolutely core to the series. These two main characters fall in love and are basically in that state, whether they are together on the same ship or not, for the rest of the 6 seasons of this series. But while that is a core aspect of the series itself, and again, character motivations for both Naomi and Holden, it's not a romance. It has that romance element, and there are some other romance elements in it, but it's not a romance. It is a mystery, a political thriller, a war movie or series, an exploration series, a gangster at some point. It's just, and an alien, well, invasion isn't the right word, an alien discovery series. It's all of those things at least the same level of complexity as the romance. So that's why I can't really call this 100% a romance science fiction story. I think the romance between Naomi and Holden will go down as one of the most honest, real, and complex romances in almost any kind of fiction, but certainly in science fiction. But then again, everything else about this or about this series, can be treated that way. The political intrigue between Earth and Mars and the Belt is some of the most complex political intrigue in any political fiction story. The same can be said about the mystery, or the various mysteries. The mystery at the core, at the very beginning of what happened to Julie Mao, and then, what is this alien technology? Who has seen it? Is it being used somehow? What does it mean? What is it going to do to humanity? All of that is as complex as anything that's ever been written that I've read in any fiction. So, yes, Naomi and Holden's relationship is fascinating and amazing, but then again, everything else in that series is at the same level, and so you can't really call it just a romance science fiction. Um, all right, so then we move on to my number one. And my number one, I've talked about a couple of times for various different topics on this very series, No Nerd Caliber, and that is the anime Steins Gate. Steins Gate is brilliant. It's brilliant science fiction. It's brilliant thriller. It has moments of fantastic comedy. It's just so ridiculously well done. It is the story of the gentleman in the center there, Rintaro Okabe, who actually goes by a different name when you first meet him because he has this, he affects this persona of a mad scientist that very quickly gets washed away as circumstances around him force him to become much more serious about life. The two women in this photo are the two women that form sort of a romantic triangle, although it's not really, a triangle in that, Okabe is absolutely smitten with Kurisu. Basically, her name is Chris, but the Japanese Kurisu, which is the redhead, who is a genius at a level that he, in his persona, thinks he is. And he actually is, really. He's incredibly smart. And his longtime, sort of very close friend, who is very honest about the fact that she is madly in love with him. That's Mayuri, the one with the hat and the blue dress. But the romance in this is really between Okabe and Kurisu, and it is deeply tragic, incredibly compelling. The story is a time travel story. Okabe and his friends have been working on, kind of as a joke, but kind of not, time travel. And the idea that they can send things into the past using an IBM PC and a microwave. Kurisu, as it turns out, is a genius in the kind of physics that deals with the possibilities of time travel. And when they meet, she winds up helping them solve that problem. And they are able to actually send messages back in time that allow them to change some of the conditions that lead to a slightly different future. So their reality changes. Until it gets to the point where a change is bad enough that Okabe tries to fix it, and it doesn't seem to work. It's like there is some sort of universal inertia around this one particular thing that means that one of two options have to happen. He cannot change it to a third option. And of course, those two options are Mayuri dies or Kurisu dies. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful bit of writing, incredibly moving. It is even more amazing in that it is based on one of the biggest internet hoaxes of the very, very early days of the internet, before the web, going back to like bulletin board forums, about John Teeter. And again, if you don't know who that is, look it up. It's amazing. That's a rabbit hole you're not going to come out of for a long time. It's a character that actually really dropped messages about the fact that he was supposedly from the future, and that, time travel was possible because of the particular mechanical setup of one specific IBM PC, worked with various other technologies that were more into the future. It was brilliant. brilliant, absolutely brilliant internet hoaxery, the kind of stuff that obviously the people who created Q looked at and went, you know what? We can do that too. We can make people believe stuff that is just absolutely ridiculous. They obviously took it in a different direction than just trying to, punk people into believing that time travel is real. But that is core. That internet hoax legend is core to this story. And it's amazing. And it has impact on other characters within the story who also have, their own romantic aspects to the story. But the romance is almost entirely Okabe and Kurisu. So if you've not seen Steins Gate, it's a 24 episode series that came out in 2011. It's wonderfully animated. It's a very complex story. I watched the first episode the first time I tried to watch it and just went, that doesn't make any effing sense whatsoever. I'm done. And it wasn't until I forced myself to come back to it years later and watch through to at least episode 2 and then 3 that I went, all right, this is like really something here. I get what they were doing with episode 1 now. But if you do try to watch it, if you haven't watched it and you do try to watch it, please watch at least 2 episodes, if not 3. Because episode 1 is just going to make you scratch your head and go, WTF did I just watch? But, Steins Gate is one of my absolute favorite stories of all time for all kinds of reasons, because of the complexity of the plot, because of the time travel science fiction elements of it, because of how in 2011 it was one of the most progressive stories about a trans individual that I'd ever seen. Again, one of the, I guess, side characters would be the best way to put it. One of the secondary characters, not one of the main romantic trio here, but still a very important character who actually drives a fair amount of a few episodes of plot. And it's just fantastic treatment of that character. So yeah, it's a wonderful series. I can't recommend it highly enough. If you like time travel, if you're willing to give anime a shot, even if you're not an anime fan, and you like time travel and really emotional science fiction stories, check out Steins Gate. And for whatever reason, the author it's actually originally a visual novel. It's Steins with no apostrophe, so like the person's name is not Stein, it's Steins, and then semicolon Gate. All stuck together. So, anyway, Steins Gate, check it out. And that's it, folks. That's the list. Those are my favorite romance stories within science fiction. There are plenty of others out there that could have been added to this. Pardon me. WALL-E really would be a good one. Because at its core, it is, in fact, a love story. But these are the ones that really affected me the most. I think that I probably should have replaced Dancer from Atlantis with WALL-E. But anyway. So, what do we got coming up? Tomorrow, of course, is Nerd Week Live. Lots of really interesting stuff. There will be, of course, a remembrance of George Perez, who passed away this last Friday. And there's just not enough to say about what an amazing artist he is. I only actually encountered him to speak with him once. And I'll tell that story, in tomorrow's show. But it was amazing. He is everything everybody says he was. And then this coming Thursday, like I said, the reason we are doing a romance story this time instead of pirates is that we swapped Our Flag Means Death to next Thursday, so the 19th. So this Thursday, the 12th, will be the movie Moonshot, a rom-com about people traveling, I believe, to a colony on Mars, which makes me wonder why it's called Moonshot. So you can tell I haven't seen it yet. So, and then of course upcoming cons I guess our next con really is Anime Boston. That is May 27th through the 29th. I will be running the photo department. If you want to get your free cosplay photos, stop in at room 102, the Cosplay Photo Studio Suite. We will also have a table out in Community Row, but that's where our press team will be, and that'll be mostly around video. So where we'll be doing questions of the day and things like that. So check us out in both of those locations, but definitely to get your free Nerd Caliber photos, come around to room 102. If you do happen to stop at the Community Row table, they'll just tell you to do that. So we will see you at that con. We'll see you at an upcoming show. In the meantime, please, folks, do stay safe. Continue to wear your mask. It's just the smart thing to do. And we will